Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos just like this every single week. So if you think that's something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and switch on your little notification bell so that YouTube will notify you every time that I post. Also, I hope you had a good Christmas. I'm filming this before Christmas, but it should be going live, I think, a couple of days after. So I hope you all had a really nice Christmas break. And if you don't celebrate Christmas, I hope you just had a nice December 25th. But anyway, this week we are going to be talking about the case of a woman named Nisha Patel Nasri. This case is honestly a bit of a roller coaster, and it was one that took a while for the police to solve because in the beginning they had a real lack of evidence. But eventually they were able to piece Nisha's case together, and once they did, they uncovered the shocking truth about her death. So our case today took place in May of 2006 in the town of Wembley, which is in northwest London in England. And this is Nisha Patel Nasri. She was a 29-year-old woman originally from Luton, which is a town in Bedfordshire in the south of England. Now, there isn't actually too much information online that I could find anyway about Nisha's upbringing and her background. I know at the start of these videos I like to tell you a little bit about the person's life before their death, but there isn't really much information available about Nisha, although I do know that she had a brother named Caton. And at the time of this case taking place in 2006, Nisha also had a husband. He was 33 years old and his name was Fadi Nasri. Nisha and Fadi had been married for about 3 years and they lived together in a house in Wembley in London. Now, Nisha worked as a hairdresser. She actually ran her own hairdressing business from her parents' home, which had been left to her and her brother. But as well as that, as well as hairdressing, Nisha also did some part-time volunteer work as a special constable for the Metropolitan Police, and this was something that she had been doing for roughly 3 years. Nisha didn't get paid for doing this. Like I said, she was a volunteer, but I think that just shows you the kind of person she was. She was clearly incredibly selfless. She didn't care about getting paid for this. She was doing it because she wanted to help people. She wanted to help keep her community safe. Nisha was also described as being a feisty character. She wasn't the kind of person that was afraid of confrontation. She was fiery and gutsy. Now, much like his wife Nisha, Fadi Nasri also had a business of his own. He ran a limousine company, so when people wanted a limo, they would go to Fadi and he would rent one to them. And it seemed as though both businesses were going well. Fadi seemed to enjoy his job and Nisha enjoyed her work as a hairdresser and a police constable. And to be honest, everything about their relationship seemed perfect. They appeared to be very happy. They were both very well liked within the community and they seemed to be excited about their future together. In fact, just the night before this case took place, Fadi and Nisha went out for a meal together to celebrate their 3rd wedding anniversary. However, within the next 24 hours, Nisha Patel Nasri would be dead. It was late in the evening on the 11th of May 2006, and that night Nisha was actually home alone because her husband Fadi was out with a friend. They were at a local snooker hall that night and they were playing snooker. It was around like 11:30 p.m, so it was very late at night and most people on Nisha's street were asleep. That was until the sound of someone screaming woke them up. The neighbours heard piercing, horrendous screams coming from someone on the street, and so a lot of them came out of their houses to see what was going on, and that was when they noticed that there was blood all over one of the local houses' driveways. It was Nisha Patel Nasri's house. Nisha was lying in her driveway in a pool of her own blood and she was losing a lot of blood. She had been viciously stabbed by someone and they had just run off, fled the scene and left her to die. So neighbours rushed straight to Nisha's aid, and at this point Nisha was unconscious and she was just clinging on to life. She needed help immediately, and so they contacted 999.
My neighbour next door to me has been stabbed and there is blood everywhere. We think it's somebody in the street. He was outside her house. Yeah, look, there's blood all over.
Right, madam, calm down and bear with me.
There's a lot of blood.
Okay, right, bear with me, I'll get the police down from the way. Don't mind me.
Please, as soon as she's unconscious.
Whilst one neighbour called 999, another contacted Nisha's husband, Fadi, who, as I said, was out playing snooker that night. But as soon as he received the news that his wife had been stabbed, he rushed straight back home. Nisha's brother, Caton, was also told the news, and he literally ran straight to his sister's house as soon as he heard. He only lived a couple of streets away, I think, so he just ran to his sister's home. Her husband Fadi arrived home just after paramedics and he followed the ambulance to the hospital. However, Nisha's injuries were very, very severe. She had one single stab wound in the thigh, but it was very deep, and this wound severed an artery, so she had lost a huge amount of blood. Doctors did absolutely everything they could to treat Nisha, but sadly they were unable to save her, and within an hour of being attacked, 29-year-old Nisha Patel Nasri was pronounced dead. Nisha had been attacked on her own doorstep, and whoever had done this was on the loose. They had no idea who the attacker was or why they did this. So now the police had a murder inquiry on their hands, and the victim was one of their own. Nisha was a volunteer police constable, but she was treated the same as any other police officer, regardless of whether she was paid or not. This was one of their own that had been savagely murdered, and so they knew they were going to stop at nothing to catch the killer and get justice for Nisha. People just couldn't believe, they couldn't grasp that something like this could have happened in this kind of area. Nisha and Fadi lived on a quiet, friendly street that had pretty low crime rates, so it was a huge shock to the community when Nisha was stabbed, and everyone was terrified. Detective Chief Inspector Nick Scola was assigned to the case, and he led the investigation into Nisha's murder. And soon after Nisha was stabbed, the crime scene, which was her own driveway, was cordoned off by the police, and detectives and forensic teams began examining the scene and looking for evidence, and they began trying to piece together exactly what had happened that night. Who had done this to Nisha and why? Was this just a random attack, or had Nisha been targeted? Was her killer just a random stranger, or did she know them? Was this a personal attack? As I said earlier, there was a lot of blood at the scene, mostly on her driveway, indicating that this was the place where the attack happened. She had been stabbed literally on her doorstep. There was a little trail of blood outside of her driveway on the street, so it looked as though after Nisha had been stabbed and the killer had fled, she had walked out of her driveway in an attempt to get some help, but she was just in such a bad way that she just walked back to her drive and collapsed. In the beginning of this investigation, detectives believed that this was a burglary gone wrong case. However, after having looked in Nisha's house, they pretty much ruled out this theory. Because the house was undisturbed, it didn't appear as though there was anything missing. In fact, in the living room were Nisha's mobile phone, her purse, and some cash, which was her hairdressing earnings from that day. I believe she had like a couple £100 in cash just out in the living room, and you'd think if this was a robbery, this would be the first thing the attacker would pick up, but they didn't. So there were no signs of a burglary, and there were also no signs of a break-in. No one had attempted to break into the house. Nisha's husband, Fadi Nasri, also had a limousine parked right outside the house. If you remember, he had a limousine company, and it didn't appear as though anyone had attempted to steal the vehicle. There wasn't any damage to the vehicle. So yeah, it didn't appear as though this was a burglary because nothing was missing. Apart from one thing. There was one thing missing from Nisha's home, and it was a large knife that was originally in her kitchen. This knife had been taken from a knife block in the kitchen, and next to where this knife block was, there were several champagne glasses. And these hadn't been smashed or anything, they were completely undisturbed, which indicated that whoever had taken this knife hadn't done so in a struggle or in a rush, because if they were in a rush to grab this knife, chances are they would have knocked over the glasses. But the police couldn't find this knife anywhere. It was not in Nisha's home, it was not on the driveway. They just couldn't find it, which led them to believe that this knife was the murder weapon and the killer had taken it away with them. But if this knife was the murder weapon, then that most likely means that the killer didn't come to the scene armed. They didn't bring their own murder weapon. Does that mean that their intention wasn't actually to kill Nisha? And if so, what was the motive for this whole thing then? There was no evidence in the house that suggested that the killer had entered Nisha's home. Like I said, it was obvious from the amount of blood that this attack took place on the driveway. And when Nisha was discovered lying in a pool of her own blood, she had her night clothes on. So all of this indicated to the police that that night Nisha had gotten up out of bed and something or someone probably startled her or scared her outside. So she went downstairs and she grabbed the knife from the knife block in the kitchen and she opened the front door to confront whatever was out there, and that was when she was attacked. They believe that the attacker wrestled the knife off of Nisha, stabbed her in the thigh, and then fled the scene. And then minutes later, Nisha was discovered by her neighbours and the paramedics were called. So the police's theory was that Nisha was stabbed with a knife from her own kitchen. But they needed to find this knife. They needed to find the murder weapon. And so they turned to the public and asked anyone with any information about this knife to come forward immediately. The police also asked Nisha's husband, Fadi Nasri, to do a public appeal. They were hopeful that seeing Nisha's grieving husband would encourage people to come forward with information.
She had a good heart, always very, very bubbly, always willing to help everyone. Everyone's grieving and missing her very much. Obviously, someone's got a guilty conscience. Someone has got to know something. Who lives around them, a neighbour, or seen some blood, or someone acting suspiciously or nervous. It might not be important, but just give us a call and let us know.
After the murder, Nisha's husband Fadi was questioned by the detectives because, of course, as soon as something like this happens, one of the first things the police do is speak to friends and family of the victim, just to get a better idea of what their lives are like and whether they had any enemies that might want to do this to them. But also they want to make sure they can rule those closest to the victim out as suspects. And in Fadi's case, they were pretty confident that he had nothing to do with his wife's murder. He had a rock-solid alibi for the time of the attack. As I've mentioned a couple of times, he was playing snooker with a friend that night, and CCTV footage from inside the snooker hall confirmed this. So he was nowhere near the crime scene. So they were pretty certain that he wasn't involved. They weren't ruling him out entirely, but for now they were happy with his story. And so they asked Fadi if he or Nisha had any enemies. Was there anyone in their life that would have wanted to do this to her? And Fadi told the police about a few strange things that had happened before his wife's murder that he thought could have been linked to the attack. Apparently, just a few nights before Nisha was killed, a couple of young men tried to break into the house when she was home alone. So Nisha went to the front door and she confronted these men, but as soon as she did, they left the property. And she was really, really startled by this, as I'm sure you can imagine. And then just a few days later, Nisha was killed on her doorstep. So the police began thinking that maybe these were linked. Maybe the men that tried to break into her home that night came back a few days later and killed Nisha. Or maybe this incident wasn't linked at all. They couldn't say for certain until they had properly investigated this lead. But the police also learned from Fadi that someone had recently been threatening him and his wife. He had been receiving threats over the phone from the owner of another car hire company from Scotland that he had been doing business with. He had had an argument with this car hire company because basically Fadi agreed to sell one of his limos to the owner of this company as long as he could borrow it back sometime soon for one last job that he had lined up. And then after that, after he had used it for this one last job, it was completely theirs, and they agreed, they accepted this deal. However, when the owner in Scotland received this limo, they were really unhappy with the condition it was in. They felt as though Fadi had kind of cheated them out of their money because the limo wasn't in the best condition, and so they refused to let him have it back for this one last job. But Fadi needed the limo. He had this job lined up, so he needed it back, and so he came up with a plan. He booked the limo from this company under a false name, and then he travelled all the way to Scotland and he stole it. He stole the limo that he had just sold to the owner. And obviously when the owner realised what had happened, they were furious with Fadi Nasri and they began threatening him and his wife over the phone.
Get your wife out of your house now. And I'm not joking in that. You have with the wrong person here, pal. You are so dead.
So Fadi handed his phone over to the police so that they could listen to the recordings of the threatening phone calls he had been receiving. And he told them that he was concerned that maybe the owner of this car hire company in Scotland had killed his wife as revenge for what he did. I believe Fadi did eventually return the limo to the company, but the police knew that they had to investigate this lead anyway because this woman on the phone was directly threatening Fadi and Nisha. Maybe she travelled to London and killed Nisha herself, or maybe she hired someone to do it for her. Maybe the intended target of this attack was actually Fadi, but because he wasn't home that night, they decided to attack his wife instead. So the police travelled to Scotland and they questioned this woman from the car hire company. However, eventually they were able to rule her out completely as having anything to do with Nisha's death. She said that she just made those phone calls in a moment of anger. Yes, she did threaten Fadi and Nisha, but she didn't mean it. They were empty threats, and she was ruled out as a person of interest in this case. So now a lead that originally seemed quite promising was a dead end, and the police were back to square one with this investigation. Soon it had been 10 days since Nisha was killed, and the police were still looking for the murder weapon, which they believed was the knife missing from the kitchen. And the search for this knife was very intense. They were looking literally everywhere around the local areas for it, just in case the killer had dumped it. They were using metal detectors, and they were searching people's gardens and local parks, and they were searching drains and dustbins. They were doing everything they could to try and find it, but it was proving very difficult, and they began thinking that they would never find it. But then, just as they were about to call off the search for the murder weapon, they found something. One day they were searching the drains along a street that was 10 streets away from where Nisha was murdered, when one of the officers spotted something. They spotted a knife in one of these drains. It had been pushed into some soil in the drain and the handle was sticking up. So immediately they collected this knife as evidence and it was sent off for forensic testing, although the police were very concerned that finding any forensic evidence on the knife would be difficult, because if it was the murder weapon, it had most likely been in this drain since Nisha's murder. The killer probably dumped it right after, and there was running water in this drain, so they were fearful that any evidence originally present on it would have just been washed away. However, after running tests, they discovered that Nisha Patel Nasri's DNA was on it. They were able to prove that this was the knife that was missing from Fadi and Nisha's home, and it was the murder weapon. This knife had been used to stab Nisha in the thigh. It was a silver John Lewis knife that was 13 inches long. However, unfortunately, they couldn't find any trace of the killer's DNA on this knife. So after this setback, the detectives decided to have a look through the CCTV footage from the street where the knife was dumped, because maybe they might be able to get an image of the person dumping it. Luckily, there was a CCTV camera pointed very close to the drain that the knife was found in. The drain wasn't actually in shot of this CCTV camera, but like I said, it was very close to it. So they started going through the footage from this particular camera, and they noticed something. Okay, so this part might be a little bit difficult to explain, so just bear with me, but I'm about to show you some CCTV footage from the night that Nisha was killed, just after she was attacked. Okay, so on this footage, you can see a parked car. Now, the drain where the murder weapon was dumped is just a little bit behind this parked car, although, like I said, the drain itself is not in view of the CCTV camera. However, if you look at the back of the parked car, you can see that another car pulled up behind it for a short while, and you can tell this because you can see the headlights from the car shining onto the parked car. Now, the car that pulled up behind the parked car would have been right beside the drain where the police found the murder weapon, and the car stopped for around 7 seconds beside the drain before driving away, giving whoever was in the car enough time to reach out of the window and drop the knife into the drain. I really hope that made sense. When the car started up again, the CCTV camera spotted it driving away. However, unfortunately, because of how dark it was around 11:30 at night, and because of how grainy the footage was, the police couldn't make out the number plate of this vehicle. All they could really tell about this car from the footage was that it was an Audi A4 car. But of course, that bit of information wasn't too helpful because there were thousands and thousands of Audi cars in the UK. It was going to be so difficult finding this exact one that dumped the murder weapon because they didn't have the number plate. However, the detectives did notice a couple of things about this specific Audi car that stuck out and were a little unusual. Firstly, they noticed that the number plate at the back of the car had one of its lights missing. One of the number plate lights was not working. And secondly, they noticed that this Audi car had a Stinger aerial in the centre of the roof. Now, when the police asked the Audi dealership about this aerial in the centre of the roof, they said that this was a non-standard roof aerial, and that if the car was brought from an actual Audi dealership, then they wouldn't have put the aerial there. So this made this particular Audi car a little bit unique and a little bit more identifiable. So one team of detectives were tasked with trying to find this car from the CCTV footage. Meanwhile, other detectives were looking into other lines of inquiry in this investigation. They began looking a little bit more into Nisha's husband, Fadi Nasri, because even though he had a rock-solid alibi for the time of the murder, they still couldn't rule him out entirely just yet. Detectives started having a look into his phone records just to see if there was anything on his phone that they should be concerned about. And they did find something on there that made them a little bit suspicious. They discovered that Fadi Nasri had recently been in regular contact with a well-known local drug dealer named Roger Leslie. Now, Roger Leslie was a very violent man, and as you can see from this picture of him, he had a lot of piercings and studs on his face, and he would tell people that each stud represented a person he had killed. So the police began wondering why Fadi Nasri was in contact with a notorious violent drug dealer. The police were just really struggling to work out the connection here, why these two people were in contact with each other. They had a lot of theories going around their heads. Maybe Fadi took drugs himself. Maybe Fadi and Roger were involved in drug trafficking together through Fadi's limousine company. Maybe Roger Leslie was involved somehow in Nisha's murder. Maybe this was a drug deal gone wrong situation and his intended target was Fadi Nasri. But because he wasn't home that night, Leslie decided to stab his wife instead. Or another theory was that maybe Fadi and Roger Leslie were both involved in the murder. Maybe Fadi Nasri had hired Leslie as a hitman, or hired him to find a hitman, because Roger Leslie had a lot of criminal connections. Like I said, there were a lot of theories flying around. The police didn't know what to think. The two, Roger Leslie and Fadi Nasri, had exchanged many phone calls, but there was one in particular that really concerned the police. They found that literally just after Nisha was attacked that night, before Fadi was told about it by the neighbours, he received a call from Roger Leslie, which of course appeared very suspicious. Why was Roger Leslie ringing Fadi that night? Was it connected to the attack? At this point, the police didn't really have any evidence to support any of these theories that they were coming up with, but they knew that they had to look into this Roger Leslie lead, and so they decided to have a look into Leslie's phone records. They wanted to see if they could pinpoint where Roger Leslie was when he made that phone call to Fadi Nasri on the night that his wife was killed. Was he near the crime scene? They could tell from looking at his phone records which cell tower his mobile phone had used for a signal when he made those phone calls to Fadi Nasri, and they discovered that Roger Leslie wasn't actually near the scene of the murder. So that pretty much ruled him out as being the one who stabbed Nisha, but it doesn't rule him out entirely. It doesn't mean he wasn't involved somehow. They continued looking into Roger Leslie's phone records anyway, and they discovered that shortly after Leslie had made that phone call to Nisha's husband Fadi, he had made another phone call to another man, and this man's name was Tony Emmanuel. Tony Emmanuel worked as a nightclub promoter, and again the police began thinking, well, what connection did he have to notorious drug dealer Roger Leslie? Did Tony have anything to do with whatever was going on here? Did he have any connections to the murder of Nisha Patel Nasri? After looking into Tony Emmanuel, the detectives discovered something very interesting about him. He owned an Audi A4 car, the same car that was caught on CCTV near the drain where the murder weapon was dumped. So the police immediately went to have a better look at Tony's car, and they noticed that his Audi had the unique non-standard Stinger aerial on the roof, and that one of his rear number plate lights wasn't working, just like the one on the CCTV footage. This was the car from the CCTV footage, the car that they believed the knife, the murder weapon, was dumped from. So now the police had the breakthrough they had been waiting for in this case. They finally had someone that could actually be linked to the crime, Tony Emmanuel. They didn't know exactly what his involvement was just yet, whether he actually committed the murder or whether he just dumped the weapon. They still needed to work that out, but they knew that he had to be involved somehow. So Tony Emmanuel was arrested and the police seized his car for forensic testing. They wanted to see if they could find any evidence in the car linking him to Nisha. For example, her blood. So they began lifting and picking up fibres from the car to test, and they also used luminol, which is a chemical that forensic teams use to detect trace amounts of blood. And from using luminol, they were able to tell that there had been a bloody knife in the armrest of the car. By this point, it had been around 6 months since Nisha was killed. This investigation was moving pretty slowly because for a long time, they had virtually no evidence in this case and no leads. But now the detectives were getting closer to piecing together what happened the night that Nisha was stabbed. As I said, they arrested Tony Emmanuel on suspicion of murder, and they also arrested Roger Leslie, the drug dealer that Emmanuel had been in contact with that night. The police began questioning the two men about this case, but they both stayed very, very quiet. They said no comment in response to most of the questions they were asked, and they denied any involvement in the death of Nisha Patel Nasri. However, Tony Emmanuel couldn't really deny it for long. They had evidence against him. They had the CCTV footage of his car near the drain where the murder weapon was dumped, and they had forensic evidence from inside the car that proved a bloody knife had been in there. So he couldn't really deny that he wasn't linked to the crime at all. And so eventually he made a confession to the police. Tony Emmanuel admitted that on the night of Nisha Patel Nasri's murder, he was outside of her house in his car at the time that she was stabbed. And he was the one who drove the car to her house. However, he claimed that he was told he was just going to be the driver taking someone else to do a drug deal, and that he had no idea what was actually going to happen that night. And he said that he had a passenger in his car who was the one that committed the murder. So the police asked Tony, who was this person in the car with you then? Who was the one that stabbed Nisha? But Tony refused to give this person's name over. He was terrified, and he said that if he gave the person's name over to the police, it would put his life at risk. He was so scared that he would be killed if he identified the passenger in his car. But the police needed to know who was in that car with Tony Emmanuel, because Tony claimed that the passenger was the person who attacked Nisha. The police knew that it couldn't have been Roger Leslie because his phone signal at the time of the murder proved he was nowhere near the scene of the crime. And they also knew that the passenger wasn't Nisha's husband, Fadi Nasri, because he was playing snooker that night with a friend, and there was CCTV footage that proved this to be true. So if it wasn't either of those two men, who was it? Who was the passenger in this car? The detectives continued questioning Tony Emmanuel about this unidentified passenger. They kept pushing him to tell them who it was. And eventually he cracked. And he told them that the other person in the car with him that night was a man named Jason Jones. Jason Jones worked as a bouncer for a local nightclub, and he was someone that the police knew well. He had 76 previous criminal convictions for things such as robbery, theft, and assaulting a police officer. And now he was a suspect in a murder inquiry. Tony said that that night, the night that Nisha was killed, he drove Jason Jones to her house after being told by him that he was just going there to carry out some sort of drug deal. Tony claimed that he stayed in the car the whole time whilst Jason Jones got out of the car and stabbed Nisha Patel Nasri. And then soon after, he ran back to the car car, jumped inside and told Tony to drive away immediately. So Tony Emmanuel was claiming that he knew nothing about this whole thing. He had absolutely no idea that he was going to be driving a car that would be involved in a murder. He thought that it was just a drug deal. And to be honest, there were a couple of things that backed up Tony's story and indicated to the police that he was telling the truth. For example, if you remember, it was found on Roger Leslie's phone that on the night of the murder, he had been in contact with Tony Emmanuel. Well, when Tony was asked about this, he said that he never actually spoke to Roger Leslie and that it was Jason Jones using his phone to speak to Roger. So Jason used Tony's phone that night to contact Roger Leslie. Tony was never actually in contact with Leslie himself. And this was pretty much proven to be true when it was found that Jason Jones had also contacted a couple of his friends that night using Tony's phone. He contacted people that Tony didn't even know and had never rung before, so that indicated that Jason was the one using the phone. Another thing that corroborated Tony's story was that he told the police that after the murder, Jason Jones told him that he had noticed that there was some cash on the sofa in the lounge in Nisha's house. If you remember from earlier on in the video, there was some cash in the lounge. It was the cash that Nisha had made from her hairdressing jobs that day. However, the police never released this bit of information to the public, so the only person that could have known about this cash and could have seen it would have been her killer. However, there was one thing about this that just didn't seem to make sense, the fact that Jason said he had been inside the house. The reason this didn't quite add up was because throughout the whole investigation, the police believed that the whole attack took place outside of the house on the driveway because that's where all the blood was. They originally thought that that night Nisha had grabbed the knife from her kitchen to confront someone that was outside of her home, and then when she reached her driveway, the knife was wrestled off her and she was stabbed by the attacker. They didn't think the attacker had been inside her home. But now they were being told by Tony Emmanuel that Jason Jones had seen some cash on the sofa. How would Jason have seen that cash if he hadn't been inside the house? He must have gone inside the house at some point. It couldn't have been after the attack because the neighbours rushed to Nisha's aid as soon as they heard the screams and they would have seen him. So he must have been inside the house before the attack happened. But how did he get into the house? So it seems very unlikely that Nisha would have let him in because she wouldn't have known this man, she wouldn't have known Jason, and she was already very scared of someone breaking in because if you remember, a couple of men had tried to break into her house just a couple of days before she was killed. So she was very startled by that, and so it's very unlikely that she would have let him in. And there were no signs of a break-in. He hadn't forced his way into the house, which led the police to the conclusion that Jason Jones must have had a set of keys to the house. Their theory now was that Jason Jones had his own set of keys, so he let himself into the house that night whilst Nisha was upstairs, probably sleeping. They believe he just started walking around the house, probably looking for a weapon, and that was when he noticed that there was cash on the sofa. And then when he went into the kitchen, he noticed the knife block on the side and he decided to quietly pick up one of the knives, being careful not to knock over the champagne glasses as he did so. But at some point, the noise of someone downstairs must have woken Nisha up, and so she grabbed a torch and went down, and she noticed a stranger was in her house. It's believed that as soon as Nisha saw this stranger, she just made a run for the front door because she didn't know what else to do. So she just ran out of the front door, but Jason ran after her with the knife in his hand, and he caught up to her on the driveway where he stabbed her once in the thigh. And then as soon as he stabbed her, Jason jumped back into Tony's car and ordered him to drive away. So this was now the police's believed version of events, their theory. They believed that Jason Jones had let himself into Nisha's house that night. But who gave him the keys? The most obvious answer would be Nisha's husband, Fadi Nasri. He must have provided the keys, meaning that he must have been involved in this somehow. But what was his motive? What reason did he have for wanting his wife dead? So as we know, over the course of this investigation, the detectives had been looking into Fadi Nasri's phone. He gave it to them when he was showing them the threatening phone calls he had been receiving from the car hire company woman in Scotland. And they were still looking through the phone now for any other evidence. From looking through his call history, they had already found that he had been making phone calls to drug dealer Roger Leslie. But they also found some other things on the phone that were really concerning. They downloaded all of the pictures that Fadi had on his phone, and one of the first pictures they looked at was of a woman's bare leg in bed. And I think straight away the police had their suspicions that this leg wasn't Nisha's, his wife. So they continued looking through the rest of the pictures on his phone, and there were a lot of Fadi with another woman. And he was very close to this woman in these pictures. I think in a couple of them she was kissing him on the cheek. So the detectives began thinking that maybe Fadi was cheating on his wife Nisha and was having an affair with this woman. So they asked Fadi about these pictures and they asked him who this woman was. And at first he didn't really say anything. I believe he denied any memory of these pictures ever being taken. But then later on in the investigation, he came forward to the detectives and he admitted that he in fact had been having an affair with this woman whose name was Laura. And he said that he had been unfaithful to his wife Nisha. Now I read on a couple of news articles that Fadi had been seeing Laura for about 3 months before Nisha was killed, and the way in which he met her was through her work as a sex worker. Apparently Fadi cheating on Nisha was not a one-time thing. According to these articles, he had cheated on her multiple times with multiple different sex workers, but she had absolutely no idea. And then he met Laura. He paid her for sex a few times, but eventually they began actually dating, and they would regularly meet up behind Nisha's back. They would meet up in hotels and he would buy her expensive gifts, and Fadi even took Laura on holiday to Egypt, and he told his wife Nisha that the reason he was going to Egypt was to visit his sick uncle. She was none the wiser that her husband was having an affair. So now the police are realising that this grieving husband wasn't even faithful to his wife before she had passed. This whole devoted, loving husband he was coming across as was just an act. He clearly didn't care about Nisha or her feelings, and Fadi Nasri was looking more and more suspicious every day. At this point, the police had a lot of reason to believe that Fadi was involved in his wife's murder somehow, and they began thinking that maybe his mistress Laura was also involved. Nisha was effectively in the way of them both being a proper couple, so maybe together Fadi and Laura came up with a plan to get rid of her. So they brought Laura into the police station for questioning. They wanted to determine whether or not she had any part in what happened to Nisha Patel Nasri. However, the detectives were eventually able to rule Laura out as a suspect. There was no evidence whatsoever to suggest that she was involved or knew what was going to happen to Nisha that night. They did look through Laura's phone though, and they found even more pictures of her with Fadi Nasri, further proving that he was having an affair. And as I'm sure you can imagine, when Nisha's family found out the truth that Fadi had been cheating on Nisha for months before her death, they were so upset and shocked, because Nisha was so loyal to him, so loyal to her husband, and they thought that he was to her too. And when Nisha died, her family, particularly her brother Caton, he was always there for Fadi because he felt so sorry for him. He thought that Fadi loved Nisha, so it must have just been such a stab in the back for him when he found out the truth, because he pretty much treated Fadi like he was family, and Fadi just completely betrayed that. But anyway, back to the investigation. So as well as looking into Fadi's affair with Laura, the detectives also decided to have a little look into his finances. They just wanted to see what kind of financial situation he was in. And when they did, they realised that Fadi Nasri was in a lot of debt before Nisha passed away. His limousine business really was not doing very well. It was not bringing in a lot of money at all. I believe Nisha actually lent him the money to start the business, but he couldn't pay it back because it wasn't making much profit, if any. And Fadi was spending a lot more money than he was making. He liked living an expensive lifestyle, particularly with his mistress, Laura. He liked spoiling her. He would buy her expensive jewelry and other expensive gifts. He liked taking her on holiday. He would pay for hotel rooms for the two of them. He was spending money on all of these things, but he really couldn't afford them, and so he got himself into a lot of debt, and this debt was just increasing and increasing constantly. I think I read that he was more than £100,000 in debt. However, the police discovered that Fadi's wife Nisha actually had life insurance, which she had taken out about 3 months before her death, and her husband, Fadi Nasri, was the sole beneficiary of her life insurance policy, meaning if she died, he would get everything. He would get a huge lump sum of money. I think it would have been around £350,000, which, as we know, he really needed because of how much money he owed. So now Fadi Nasri had two motives for wanting his wife dead. The first was that he was having an affair and he probably wanted to be with his mistress, Laura, so he wanted to get Nisha out of the way. And secondly, he was going to be getting a lot of money from his wife's life insurance, so he had a lot to gain from her death. However, the police still needed to piece together this whole case. They had 4 men that were all clearly somehow involved in what happened to Nisha. They had her husband, Fadi Nasri, they had the drug dealer, Roger Leslie, they had Tony Emmanuel, and they had Jason Jones. Now, as we've already discussed, Tony Emmanuel told the police that he was told he was going to be the driver for a drug deal that night, and that he had no idea that in reality he was going to be the driver involved in a murder case. And he confessed to the police that he drove Jason Jones to Nisha's house and he waited in the car whilst Jason got out and stabbed Nisha. And they did believe this to be true. They did believe that Jason was the one who physically carried out the murder, and they had evidence to back this up. For example, the Cash thing, when he said that he saw Cash in the lounge. How would Jason have known that if he hadn't been in Nisha's house? Fadi Nasri's part in this was now the most obvious. He stood to gain the most from his wife's death, and so he clearly orchestrated this whole thing. He planned the killing, and he made sure that he had an alibi for the night of the murder by going to play snooker with a friend. But what about Roger Leslie? What exactly was his part in this plot? Well, we know from his phone signal at the time of the murder that he wasn't near the crime scene, so he couldn't have been involved in that aspect. But from looking at these men's phone records from the night of the murder, the police could see that just after Nisha was stabbed by Jason Jones, Jones made contact with Roger Leslie, presumably to tell him that he had just committed the murder. And then as soon as he got off the phone to Jason Jones, Leslie rang Fadi Nasri's phone and spoke to him whilst he was playing snooker. Again, it's believed in this phone call he was passing on the message that Jones had just attacked Nisha. And then minutes after this phone call, Fadi Nasri receives a call from one of his neighbours telling him that his wife had just been stabbed. And from here, the whole cover story begins. Fadi rushes home to be by his wife's side as she is dying, knowing full well that the reason she was in this state was because of him. He had set up his own wife's murder. So the police believed that Fadi Nasri was the one who ordered the murder. He made contact with Roger Leslie and asked him to find someone that could kill his wife, and he provided the keys to the house. Roger Leslie was the middleman in this crime, the organizer of this murder. As I mentioned earlier, he was a notorious drug dealer and he had a lot of criminal connections, and he managed to find Jason Jones, a man that was willing to carry out the murder. Now, I actually don't know how much money Fadi Nasri promised Roger Leslie and Jason Jones to commit this murder and be involved in this crime. I couldn't find that information online, but he did pay them, or he did intend to pay them. I just don't know how much it was. As for Tony Emmanuel, he was hired by Jason Jones to drive him to Nisha's home that night on the pretense of doing a drug deal. So this was what the police believed each of the men's roles were in this crime. They had finally pieced everything together, and so they presented everything, all of their evidence, to Nisha's husband, Fadi Nasri. And Fadi just completely broke down in front of the detectives. He began literally sobbing. But to be honest, the detectives didn't think they were real tears. They believed that he was just sobbing as a way of putting off talking to them. Anyway, he carried on crying and he had to keep going out of the room to calm himself down. But then as soon as he would go back in, he would just break down again. And in the end, he wasn't able to answer any questions because he couldn't compose himself. But that didn't really matter to the police because they believed that after 7 months of investigation, they finally understood what happened and they finally had enough evidence against Fadi Nasri to say that he was involved in this. And so in February of 2007, he was charged with the murder of his wife, Nisha Patel Nasri. Also arrested and charged with her murder were Roger Leslie, Tony Emmanuel and Jason Jones. However, all 4 of them pled not guilty to the crime, and so the case had to go to trial. Now, the police were concerned about the trial. They were concerned that the men would not be convicted for this murder plot because even though they did have quite a lot of evidence, the majority of it was circumstantial. They didn't really have any forensic evidence, so they were worried that the evidence they did have wouldn't be enough. But anyway, the trial began in early 2008 at the Old Bailey Court in London, and it went on for a couple of months as the prosecution and the defence presented their cases to the jury. At the end of the trial, the jury went away and they deliberated for 6 days before they reached their verdicts on the 4 men standing trial. And on the 28th of May 2008, just over 2 years after the murder of Nisha Patel Nasri, the verdicts were read out. The first one that was read out was Tony Emmanuel's verdict, the man who drove Jason Jones to Nisha's house on the pretense of a drug deal, and he was found not guilty. The jury believed that he genuinely had no idea about what was going to happen that night, and so he was acquitted. As for the other three men, Roger Leslie, Jason Jones and Fadi Nasri, they were all found guilty of murder. Fadi Nasri, the one who ordered the murder of his wife, was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 20 years. Roger Leslie, the organiser of the murder, was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 18 years for his part in the crime. And Jason Jones, the one who carried out the murder, was also sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 20 years. So I believe that means that Roger Leslie will become eligible for parole in 2026, and Fadi Nasri and Jason Jones will become eligible for parole in 2028. But let's hope none of them get released. And that is it for this case. That is the case of Nisha Patel Nasri. I really hope I explained the story in a way that made sense. I'm a bit paranoid that I didn't explain it very well. But yeah, that is it for this video. As usual, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case in the comments. Before I go, I do just want to say a huge thank you to the members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, then the link is always in the description box of my videos. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I hope you have a happy new year. This is probably going to be my last video of 2020, so I hope you have a good new year. Let's all pray that 2021 is a lot better than 2020 has been. But yeah, I will see you in the new year. Bye guys.